how the question will relate to the question of equity is something that I would like to find out from Mr. Anastasiou as well. But in a sense, we are still on the notion of equity, but in applying the notion of equity in the real world, the notion may be slightly different from what we have believed the notion of equity is all about. Is the title of his speech. Developmental Equity, Fair Shares Global Differentiation After Durban.
Mr. Tanajut, please.
I'm very honored to be here. I'm very honored to be here. I'm particularly honored to be the speaker chosen with saying something useful about equity after Durban, after Rio. It's a challenge. There are many ways to fall short. One in particular I would like very much to avoid. I would like to avoid being seen as naive. So let me begin by saying that within the climate negotiations, there are many sophisticated people who do indeed view equity as a danger. Many who believe that too much talk of equity, too much talk of common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities, to use the magic words, leads to sterile, circular debate and paralysis. They clearly have a point. The last 20 years proves this. In fact, the challenge of the post-Copenhagen, post-Cancun, post-Durban, post-Rio climate negotiations is to engage the equity challenge seriously, while at the same time proving that equity can in fact be a source of momentum, inspiration, cooperation, and action. That was the phrase that was held up at the bond negotiations, which Dr. Park referenced a few months ago, where the protesters were holding signs that said, "Equity is the gateway to ambition." And I'm here to explain to you why that really is true, difficult though it may be to come to terms with it. So my first question is, did Rio help? I'm gonna basically make 2 points. The first one in a set of slides and the second one in a different set of slides. Did Rio help? Well, Rio was not a failure. But Rio was not a success either. I could spend a lot of time talking about this, but I'm just going to skip this in the interest of time to emphasize this last part of my slide, which is the climate talks remain the key to the future. Rio-style processes could accomplish much more than they are currently capable of accomplishing, but only if there's a breakthrough in the climate negotiations. And there will not be a breakthrough in the climate negotiations without a breakthrough on the equity question. I can't prove this is true, but I'm asserting that it is true, and I could argue that it is true at great length, which I will not subject you to. Equity is a very difficult concept. The philosophers all disagree about exactly what the demands of equity are. What's at issue in the climate negotiations is much more focused. There has been a study done actually within the Climate Action Network, which is an international network of NGOs and policy experts, and we reached the conclusion that there really are only 3 key equity principles from the point of view of the climate negotiations. The first one is the adequacy principle. You must have a stringent global target. If you do not have a stringent global target, or if you have a regime that cannot support a stringent global target, you do not have the possibility of equity. This is for the simple reason that the poor and the vulnerable will be hurt first and most desperately. The second master equity principle, if you will, is common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities as embodied in the United Nations Framework Convention. Now, there's a lot of confusion about CBDR, RC. What we need is to move forward successfully. We need to dissipate that confusion. We need to reconcile the abstract principles with a concrete model of global differentiation that is adequate to the complexities of the existing world system. In a nutshell, we have to leave the annexes behind and find a way of defining a spectrum of obligations, a global spectrum of obligations that is fair enough to be accepted by the majority of the world community in the context of an extremely challenging climate transition. No one should believe that this is going to be easy. Such an approach must give due account to both historical responsibility and capacity to act, as you know, that these things are not equivalent to the Kyoto annexes, which have been the focus of a relatively sterile debate over the last 15 years. Finally, the third master equity principle is the right to sustainable development. This is inevitably extremely controversial. And in fact, I would go so far as to say that once we resolve the relatively simple debate about CBDR, common but differentiated responsibility and respective capability, then we can begin the real debate, the one that will take 50 years, about what sustainable development means and what kinds of rights are associated with it, beyond mere poverty alleviation. The point here is that the new phrase that embodies this problem in the context of the negotiations is equitable access to sustainable development. This is the new code, okay? Equitable access to sustainable development was a term that was introduced at the Cancun meeting, okay? And a year before Durban, and this is the text within which it was introduced. And what I want to call your attention to is that equitable access to sustainable development is explicitly defined with reference to the global peak year.